Hello everyone, welcome to Love Wave's story. I'm going to say this right away because it still makes my stomach turn. My husband didn't want guests at our wedding, not friends, not family, no one, just us, a courthouse, and a promise that it was romantic, and at the time I believed him. He said he hated attention and that weddings were fake and performative and a waste of money. He said love should be private, and then he looked me straight in the eyes and said, "If it's real, we don't need witnesses." And that sentence should have scared me, but instead it made me feel special. I was 32, in love, and tired of waiting. My friends questioned it, my mom cried on the phone, even my best friend asked me if this wasn't a red flag, and I defended him like a lawyer because I truly believed he was different, deeper, more authentic. We got married on a Tuesday morning with no white dress, no photos, no rings yet because he said we'd pick them later together, just a clerk, a signature, and his hand squeezing mine a little too tight when the words "legally binding" were said out loud. After that he took me to breakfast like nothing big had happened, pancakes, coffee, normal conversation, and I remember thinking it felt strangely quiet, like something important was missing but I couldn't name it. For months after that, whenever someone asked about the wedding he smiled politely and changed the subject. He never posted about us and never updated his status because he said he didn't like social media. And again I believed him. But then little things started piling up. His phone was always face down, his mood shifted suddenly when we ran into people he kind of knew, and one night when I suggested a small anniversary dinner with friends his face went completely cold, and that was the first moment I realized something was seriously wrong. That cold look stayed with me longer than the argument itself. He didn't yell or explain. He just said he wasn't comfortable mixing his life with other people and asked why I was pushing so hard, like I was the problem for wanting to celebrate my own marriage. I apologized that night even though I didn't understand what I did wrong, and that became a pattern I didn't notice until later. He controlled our social circle without ever saying he was doing it. Dinners got cancelled, birthdays were skipped, holidays became excuses, and slowly my world got smaller while his stayed exactly the way he wanted. Whenever I asked about his past he gave me vague answers, old coworkers he lost touch with, friends who moved away, family he wasn't close to anymore, and every story sounded reasonable on its own, so I never pressed too hard. One evening I was cleaning the apartment and found a small box in the back of his closet. It wasn't locked and I didn't feel like I was snooping at first. Inside were photos I'd never seen before, him smiling with people I didn't recognize, at bars, at parties, at what looked like a wedding that definitely wasn't ours. There was a woman in several of the pictures standing very close to him, her hand on his arm, her head leaning toward his shoulder, and when I asked who she was he laughed it off and said she was just an old friend who liked attention. His answer came too fast, like it was rehearsed, and when I asked why he never told me about her his tone shifted again and he said I was overthinking and trying to create drama where there was none. I wanted to believe that, I really did, because believing him was easier than admitting I married someone who was still a stranger. But after that night I started noticing how carefully he avoided places where people might recognize him, how he changed routes when we walked, how he introduced me only as his partner and not his wife, and every time I corrected him he squeezed my hand in that same tight way. That squeeze of his hand started to feel like a signal more than affection, and I became hyper-aware of it every time we were around anyone new, like my body was learning before my brain did. One afternoon I ran into an old co-worker of his at a grocery store, at least that's what the man said when he looked at my husband and froze for half a second too long, then smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. He congratulated us on the marriage and my husband laughed nervously and said it was nothing official yet, and I remember my heart dropping because that was the first time I heard him deny it out loud. The man looked confused, then curious, then he glanced at me like he wanted to say something but thought better of it, and after he walked away my husband exploded on me in the car, accusing me of setting him up and embarrassing him. I cried and asked why. He said we weren't married and he told me paperwork didn't mean anything and that labels made things messy, and somehow by the end of the conversation I was the one apologizing again. That night I couldn't sleep, so I searched his name online for the first time since we met. Not out of jealousy but out of a quiet fear I couldn't ignore anymore. His social media was almost empty, but buried deep in tagged photos was a comment from years ago that caught my attention. It was from the woman in the photos and it said, "Can't believe you did this again, with a laughing emoji that didn't feel like a joke at all. My chest tightened and I clicked her profile, and what I found there made my hands start shaking, because her page was public and full of posts about betrayal, silence, and rebuilding after someone who erased her existence. None of the posts named him directly, but every timeline lined up too perfectly to be coincidence. I closed my phone and stared at the ceiling, realizing that the quiet wedding might not have been about privacy at all. It might have been about erasing witnesses before they could speak. The next morning I watched him like I was seeing him for the first time, the way he moved around the kitchen, the way he checked his phone and smiled at messages he never explained, the way he acted completely normal while my chest felt tight and heavy. I didn't confront him right away because I needed to be sure I wasn't imagining things, so instead I started paying attention, and once I did I couldn't stop. He avoided posting photos with me even when we traveled. He never introduced me as his wife unless it was legally necessary, and any time I suggested meeting someone from his past he found a reason to shut it down fast. A week later I finally worked up the courage to message the woman from the photos. I told myself I was just asking for clarity and that if I was wrong I would apologize and move on, but deep down I already knew something was off. She didn't reply for 2 days, and those were the longest 2 days of my life, because every hour I imagined different versions of the truth and none of them were good. When she finally answered, she didn't ask who I was or why I was writing, she just said she had been wondering when I would reach out, and that one sentence made my stomach drop. She told me she wasn't a jealous ex or a random friend. She told me she had been engaged to him for 3 years and that their wedding was supposed to happen quietly too, no guests, no posts, no announcements, because he said he hated attention back then as well. She said she only found out the real reason later when another woman contacted her with the same questions I was asking now, and as I read her messages my hands started shaking because suddenly everything made sense in the worst possible way. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at her messages while he was in the shower humming like nothing in the world was wrong, and I remember thinking how insane it was that 2 realities could exist at the same time in the same apartment. She kept typing and every message felt heavier than the last. She told me he had a pattern and that I was not the first and probably not the last. He rushed intimacy, pushed for commitment, then slowly erased women from his public life so no one could compare notes. She said he hated witnesses because witnesses asked questions, and that's when I finally understood the wedding, not as a romantic choice but as a strategic one. I asked her why she never warned me and she said she tried, but every time she got close he disappeared completely and changed numbers, jobs, even cities for a while, and by the time she found me we were already married. When I asked her if there were others she paused for a long time and then said yes, more than she could count. Some knew about each other and some never did, but all of them had one thing in common: they were kept separate and silent. When he came out of the bathroom and kissed my forehead I felt my body stiffen, not because I was scared of him physically but because I suddenly saw him as someone capable of erasing people without remorse. That night I didn't accuse him or cry or scream. I smiled and acted normal and went to bed next to him while my mind raced, because I realized that if he built our marriage on secrecy then the truth was going to be dangerous, and I needed to be very careful about how I uncovered it. The next few weeks felt like I was living undercover in my own marriage. I stopped asking questions and started listening instead, and the more quiet I became the more he relaxed, which terrified me. He started slipping up in small ways, names he almost said out loud, stories that changed slightly each time, dates that didn't line up when I replayed them in my head late at night. I began writing everything down in my phone under fake notes so he wouldn't get suspicious, times, places, reactions, because I needed proof not just feelings. One evening he mentioned an old apartment across town and said it casually like it meant nothing, but later that night I checked our lease history and realized he had lived there during the exact same year the woman told me they were engaged. My heart was pounding but I stayed calm. I asked him about it days later like I was just curious, and he smiled and said he barely remembered that place, said it was a short phase, nothing important, and then changed the subject immediately. That's when I understood how skilled he was at redirecting reality. I reached out to another woman whose name I found buried in an old email thread, and she responded within minutes like she had been waiting for this moment. She told me he convinced her to keep their relationship secret because of work reasons and promised a future that never arrived. Every story was different on the surface but identical underneath: isolation first, commitment fast, silence always. I started to realize that the quiet wedding wasn't just about hiding his past, it was about controlling the present, because without witnesses there was no version of me that existed outside of him, and that realization scared me more than anything he had done so far. I finally confronted him on a night that felt almost too calm to be real. I didn't accuse or yell, I just asked him how many women he had asked to disappear for him, and the silence that followed was louder than any confession. His face didn't change right away, but his eyes did. They went flat and calculating, like he was deciding which version of the truth would work best. He laughed and said I was being dramatic and that insecure people always invent stories, but when I mentioned the names I had learned, his jaw tightened just enough to give him away. He told me I was digging into things that weren't my business and that the past was dead for a reason, and when I asked why he lied about our marriage to other people, he said marriage was just a legal shield and not something he owed the world. That word stuck with me, shield, because suddenly everything clicked: the quiet wedding, the missing photos, the lack of witnesses. It wasn't about love at all, it was about protection, his protection. I told him I had spoken to them, and for the first time he raised his voice, telling me I had crossed a line and broken his trust, and in that moment I realized how upside down our reality had been, because the man who built a life on lies was accusing me of betrayal. I slept on the couch that night, staring at the ceiling and understanding that leaving wouldn't be as simple as packing a bag, because when someone has erased so many people before you, you don't know what they're capable of when you refuse to disappear quietly too. The next morning I pretended everything was normal. I made coffee, set the table, smiled while he read the news like we were a normal couple, but inside I was planning every possible scenario in my head. I realized I couldn't trust him for even a second, so I started keeping track of his movements, every meeting, every call, every excuse, like I was mapping a secret world I had unknowingly married into. I even started asking subtle questions about his friends, work, and family without letting him notice, and every little slip made me more certain that the truth was much bigger than I imagined. One night I found receipts hidden in a drawer, tickets to places he said he had gone alone, and the names on the receipts matched none of the stories he had told me. That was the moment I stopped doubting myself entirely. I knew he had been manipulating everything, every word, every gesture, every quiet moment of our marriage, and the thought made my stomach turn. I realized that if I wanted to survive this emotionally and protect myself, I couldn't rely on him to ever tell the truth. I had to uncover it all myself, piece by piece, like a puzzle where every missing piece was someone he had erased before. And the scariest part was knowing he would never admit it unless he had no choice, because control had always been his strongest weapon. Over the following days I became obsessed. I checked emails, old messages, even small social media posts he thought I wouldn't notice, and every tiny detail built a bigger picture of who he really was. I realized he had a system, a way to disappear women from his life without anyone knowing, and suddenly the quiet wedding made horrifying sense. It wasn't romantic, it was a plan to isolate me completely. One afternoon I confronted him about a name I found on an old calendar, someone he never mentioned, and he froze for just a second too long, then said it was just a friend from college, nothing important. But his voice, the way he avoided eye contact, it was all wrong, and I could feel my heart beating faster as I realized I had to trust my instincts, not his words. I started meeting with the other women separately, carefully, making sure he wouldn't notice, and each conversation was worse than the last: stories of lies, manipulation, disappearing acts, all pointing to the same truth. He had built a life of secrecy long before I came along, and I was the newest piece. I remember sitting in my car one night after talking to one of them, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, thinking how perfectly he had engineered this, how carefully he had constructed a reality where no one could warn me, and that maybe love for him was never about connection, it was about control. By now I was living in a constant state of tension. Every word he said, every text, every glance, felt loaded with hidden meaning, and I realized I couldn't relax even for a second. I started documenting everything, not just for proof, but to make sense of the chaos I had married into, because living blindly was no longer an option. One evening I suggested a weekend getaway to see a place he mentioned loving as a child, and he hesitated longer than usual, checking his phone, then suddenly agreeing but insisting we leave early before anyone could see us. During the drive, I noticed the roads he was avoiding, the places he refused to mention, and I began piecing together the network of secrets that stretched far beyond our little apartment. I realized he had not only erased his past partners, but he had also carefully manipulated mutual friends, even coworkers, keeping everyone compartmentalized so that nothing overlapped, nothing could connect back to him. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. My entire marriage, every quiet dinner, every private celebration, was part of a strategy one hadn't understood until now, and the person I had trusted most in the world was a master of concealment. That night I couldn't sleep, staring at the ceiling, wondering how many more layers of his secret life I hadn't yet uncovered and if I even wanted to know. I started planning carefully, deciding I needed to confront him in a way that wouldn't let him manipulate the story, so I arranged a dinner with all the women I had spoken to separately, pretending it was just a casual meeting, but inside I was calculating every possibility. When he noticed the dinner invitations, he asked why I was involving other people, and I simply said I wanted perspective, staying calm even though my heart was pounding. He tried his usual tactics, charm, confusion, blame, but I didn't flinch. I let him speak while I watched for inconsistencies, small cracks in the persona he had built so carefully. As the evening went on, messages arrived, calls came through, and his reaction started to change, his calm facade slipping as he realized he no longer controlled the narrative. By the end of that night, he was visibly tense, quieter, and for the first time in our marriage I saw a flash of panic in his eyes, the same eyes that had once made me feel special, and I realized power had shifted, even if slightly. I knew this was only the beginning, but for the first time I felt like I wasn't just a pawn in his game. I had my own moves now, and I needed to use them carefully to uncover the rest of the truth without losing myself in the process. The days that followed were tense but revealing. I started noticing patterns in his behavior that I had ignored for too long, small lies, subtle evasions, the way he always controlled the timing of conversations, and it all pointed to the same conclusion: his life was built on secrecy, and anyone who got too close risked being erased. I confronted him one evening directly, calm but firm, listing inconsistencies, names, dates, and photos, and for the first time he didn't deflect, he didn't charm, he simply stared at me, calculating. He admitted some things but left out the most important, hoping I would be satisfied, and I realized then how deeply I had underestimated him, how carefully he had mastered manipulation. That night I sat alone in the living room, phone in hand, messages from the other women open, piecing together the fragments of his past, and felt a mix of anger, fear, and determination. I knew leaving him would be complicated, that unraveling his secrets could put me in danger emotionally, socially, and legally, but I also knew I couldn't stay blind to the truth any longer. For the first time, I felt the full weight of what I had married into, and I understood that the quiet wedding, the private life, and his insistence on isolation were never about romance, they were about control, and I had to reclaim my life before it was too late. The final confrontation came quietly, no shouting, no dramatic scene, just me sitting across from him and stating everything I knew, every woman, every secret, every lie, and watching as the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself began to crumble. He didn't fight, he didn't charm, he just looked at me with that same tight-eyed stare, and I realized I had finally stripped away the control he thought he had. I told him I wasn't leaving yet, but I was no longer blind, and for the first time he seemed uncertain, like he was experiencing a reality where he didn't set the rules. I felt relief, fear, and empowerment all at once, knowing the journey wasn't over, but that I had taken back my voice. To everyone watching, thank you for following my story. If it resonated with you, make sure to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, turn on the notification bell, and share your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear your experiences and opinions, because sometimes sharing these stories is the first step to reclaiming your own truth.